Yes, indeed.
It's a great privilege.
Can I call you to order? So, Minister, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellency, you're very welcome here today. I'm very glad you've been able to join us. This is the culmination of several months' painstaking work by the Associate Parliamentary Group for Sudan. Our report, On the Brink Towards Lasting Peace in Sudan, is published today. It's the result of hours of evidence-taking, a huge amount of careful research. Some of you who are here today have been part of that. We're very grateful to every single person who's participated. The compilation of oral and written evidence, an extraordinary level of commitment by our clerk, Natalia Chan, who's here. She's been burning the midnight oil to ensure the report was ready for today's launch, and we're enormously indebted to her. The group's chairman, Mr. David Drew MP, has unavoidably had to return to his Stroud constituency on urgent constituency business, but his absence allows me to spare his own blushes in paying tribute to him for all the work that he's undertaken on behalf of the Associate Parliamentary Group throughout the 10 years of its life. The Earl of Sandwich and I are officers of the group, along with Baroness Tong, who hadn't thought she'd be able to join us today because of some family situations that have arisen, but we're really glad that Jenny's able to be here, and she will be participating in the discussion, as she has done throughout the whole of our proceedings a little later on. We're also joined by another leading member of the group, Baroness Cox of Queensberry, who's been an active member of the team behind this report, and whose considerable knowledge of Sudan is informed by her own visits to the country. We're especially grateful to the Minister, Baroness Kinnock of Holyhead, the Minister for Africa, for her readiness to launch and speak to the report. When Glenys was a member of the European Union, European Parliament, she immediately responded when I contacted her myself after a visit to Darfur, where, of course, some 300,000 people have died, 2.2 million people have been displaced, 98% of villages have been burnt to the ground. So we have an Africa minister with a formidable track record, underpinned by her recent first-hand visits to the region. I personally first visited Sudan over 10 years ago during the civil war, in which 2 million people died. The war, which raged until the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, left a legacy of massive devastation with acute needs for many essential services, including education, healthcare and agricultural production. In 2007, only 13% of southern Sudan had an immunisation programme, increasing to 19% in 2008, and there were only 20 secondary schools serving that vast region. The ending of the war saw the return of many refugees and internally displaced people, and of course their plight remains very serious. Additionally, the failure to fulfil some of the CPA's recommendations and requirements has undermined confidence in its commitment to peace. The refusal to be transparent about oil revenues causes doubts about the fairness of allocation of resources, and the episodic outbreaks of violence instigated by militias raise serious questions about paymasters and quartermasters, and these and many other questions were those that we looked at during the course of the inquiry. I've been struck that despite the CPA, more people have died in the south during the past 12 months than even in Darfur during the same period. Peace, therefore, is extraordinarily fragile. Hence our belief that we needed to identify the key issues, make recommendations and suggest priorities, not least before this year's elections and next year's historic referendum. Despite great suffering, one of the things that's always struck me about Sudan has been the courage and the dignity of its amazing people. One of the people who personified those virtues was Abdel Salam, who came to provide evidence to the inquiry with the Redress Trust. Abdel Salam Hassan Abdel Salam died in London a few days ago. He was a guiding light of Sudan's human rights movement, an intellectual with a vivid curiosity about the complexities and the paradoxes of his country. Abdel Salam was a poet who ended up studying law, a secularist who defended the right of all to follow their beliefs, exemplified, for instance, by his defence of Sudanese Copts. He chaired the committee that organised first the 1999 Kampala Conference and later coining the phrase the Civil Project, a vision for a civil society based on justice. From 2007 he worked with the Redress Trust, and tragically he was found murdered in his Lewisham flat on Saturday last. The circumstances of his death are unclear. Before we show a short film which sets the scene for our report, I'd just like to ask you to stand for 1 minute's silence to recall the memory of a good and decent man, Abdel Salam. Thank you. Thank you very much. So in a moment we'll show the film, and immediately after that I'll invite my colleagues, the Earl of Sandwich, Baroness Cox and Baroness Tong, to address you. After that we'll hear from Sara Pantuliano, who will talk about the Chapter 3 section of our report dealing with elections, referendum and beyond. And immediately after that at 2:25, Kinnock is going to respond to the panel. So now, let's see. If you look at some of the bewildering statistics from Southern Sudan, you could feel a bit like the boy in Robert Louis Stevenson's book who says the world is so big and I'm so small, I do not like it at all, at all. You could feel utterly bewildered.
This is such a critical time for Sudan. Sudan has suffered civil war for most of the years since independence. There's now a peace agreement, fragile. There's an opportunity for the South to decide its own future. So it's a very important time to discuss key issues.
Clearly there's going to be a crucial moment next year when the comprehensive peace agreement will be tested to its very limits to see whether Khartoum, for instance, is prepared to accept the result of the referendum.
Sudan can either move forward in a peaceful and prosperous way and then on to the national referendum next year, or it can regress.
But let's assume for a moment that the referendum goes out in favour of independence. Then there will be as many issues that presents in terms of how you create a new nation, what its relations will be with its neighbours, and how you provide security both in the north and the south. That's a very big issue. How you divide the oil dividends, how you involve the international community.
The international community has supported Sudan robustly, through providing significant amounts of aid, being engaged in the political process all along. However, there have been important shortcomings, both in terms of the offering protection to civilians through the peacekeeping mission that has not been particularly effective in this respect, and also in the modalities of assistance, which has not focused on the most immediate priorities and focused too much on the center and on building the capacity of the government, while leaving some of the most pressing needs for the more isolated communities unattended.
I'm very worried about the marginalised areas, and particularly southern Kordofan, just been there. The Nuba Mountains, they're traditionally called, and people like it called Nuba Mountains, they are deeply worried because they and the other so-called marginalised areas of Blue Nile and Abyei don't really know their own future. They're worried about the loss of their African identity and culture through processes of Arabization, and they're also concerned about forced Islamization, and the Muslims are as worried about that as the Christians. And when the North tried to impose Sharia in Kadugli, that was robustly resisted by all the peoples of southern Kordofan.
It's important that the international community re-engages politically very robustly in Sudan ahead of the referendum, but it is important that this re-engagement happens in a very coordinated and as harmonized as possible fashion.
We should also have been doing more about the 2 million southerners who live in the north of the country, mainly in refugee camps and in shanty towns around Khartoum, who will not be able to register to vote in the elections this year or the referendum next year. And I think it's disgraceful that they risk being wholly alienated about the future of their country because of the registration processes. So the international community could have been doing much more about that. It could be doing much more to stop the flow of arms into Sudan.
The CPA was possible mainly thanks to the very engaged role that some of the observer countries played, particularly the UK, the US, Norway and Italy. It's that level of engagement that we need today. It's very urgent given the important appointments that Sudan is meeting this year.
I hope that Sudan will look forward to a new decade of peace, prosperity, and a country that can really live up to its potential.
It is at times difficult to be positive about the future of Sudan. However, I am encouraged by the resilience of the Sudanese, and I am sure that they will provide what is needed to take the country forward in the years to come.
It is a beautiful country, and I think it can be the jewel in the crown of that part of Africa if there is a will to do it, and I think this is the time to do it.
Chapter 2 of the report deals with the key challenges which face Sudan during transition. And I'm going to invite my colleague, the Earl of Sandwich, to kick off on this.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for letting me say a few words. I'm not only the treasurer of the all-party group, but I was on the board of Christian Aid, and I've worked with Save the Children, and I know how many NGOs probably represented in this room are dedicated to getting it right in Sudan. It's a country where outsiders are going to be for a very long time. It is not a matter of just the coming year, which is a drama in itself, but it's looking forward well beyond. And I would like to entertain the idea of a simulation game where we actually imagine we are beyond the referendum. And even though there are so many aspects we cannot tackle this afternoon, it would be good if people can put questions on the far future, is what I call the far future. Are we going to maintain the same level of engagement as we have with the CPA? Let us not forget it's without precedent, I think, in development projects in developing countries, certainly in my experience. People generally, unless they go to Sudan, cannot imagine the depth of poverty there, to the south especially. And I would like to just imagine that people who arrive in Sudan for the first time look at their own lives and reflect on the wealth of the outside world and see what Sudanese can tell us about sustainability in these conditions. Now we've got very specific recommendations, and I know the Minister will have the answers already, which relate to the aid programme, the muddle which is going on with the World Bank mechanism, the muddle that's going on in the EU, not all of Sudanese making, but it's being sorted out as far as I can tell from what she's told us already. But let us just get back to the post-referendum arrangements, and I do hope Minister will deal with that. How are we going to keep up this level of engagement, and are we encouraging all the parties to sit down and think it out now, immediately after the elections? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, John. Lady Cox now.
Minister, my noble friends, good friends here, I just want to say a very few words to highlight two of the areas of my particular concern. Many of you know I've been in Sudan many times. I was in southern Sudan and southern Kordofan just 3 weeks ago. And the points I would like to highlight, been asked to highlight, come from Chapter 2 of the report, the key challenges of the transition. And they will refer partly to the whole issue which my friend Lord Sandwich has already mentioned, good governance. The report does make recommendations concerning human rights and governance. It draws attention to some of the concerns still on those issues, particularly perhaps in the north, when there is shown recently some problems in terms of expression of freedom of speech. There are clearly problems, very real problems, challenging the government of southern Sudan, a new government, but having to be born in conditions of enormous deprivation, destitution, having had those years of war, which, as Lord Alton said, 4 million were displaced, 2 million perished, and a devastated infrastructure, hardly any roads in southern Sudan. But moving very briefly from the challenges, one of the things I was most impressed when I was in Juba with the government of Southern Sudan, they have established a Commission of Human Rights, and that is a very positive step forward. They're prepared to look very critically at their own record, their own issues to do with human rights, and that is only something that can be commended. On the humanitarian situation, Southern Sudan has enormous challenges. They're documented, some of them, on page 16 of the report. But I would just highlight three figures which, for me, show the tragedy that still continues in southern Sudan today. 1 in 7 children will die before the age of 5. Some of these statistics are additional to the ones that are in the report. 1 in 7 mothers will die in childbirth. And less than 20% of the peoples of southern Sudan have access to an immunization program, which means that 80% or so are vulnerable to the horrors, which shouldn't be available in the world today, of polio and TB and measles and the things which should be prevented, tetanus, in an immunization program. So enormous challenges, again, enormous challenges in education. There are some figures here about the desperate shortage of teachers and of schools, and especially secondary schools, and shortages of professionals like midwives. So few midwives in southern Sudan, and if you haven't got a secondary education, then you haven't got the pupil population to go into vocational and professional training. So enormous challenges confronting the peoples of the South as they move forward into whatever the future is that they will decide in the referendum. So we thought it was very important and timely at this stage to be able to highlight some of the concerns, some of the priorities, and some of the recommendations which are summarised there on page 16 with regard to continuing support, particularly for the government of Southern Sudan as it tries to build a stable government, a civil society, democratic government in conditions of great hardship and challenge. So those are the points, and just very briefly, as was showed on the short video, deep concerns from southern Kordofan or Nuba Mountains when I was there just 3 weeks ago. Of course, they're not included in the referendum. They only have a consultation, and there's no substance at the moment to that consultation. And the people there were saying they've actually suffered more since the peace agreement than under war, which is a horrendous thing to say because they suffered so much under war. But under the peace agreement, they've had very few peace dividends and much less access by many international NGOs in parts of southern Kordofan. Yeah. So that is just an additional area I would like to flag up in these introductory remarks. And we'll say no more, except to add to Lord Alton and all my colleagues our enormous appreciation of Natalia, if I may, because Natalia's done so much work for this. And we wouldn't be here, actually, if it was not a wonderful author, of course, but Natalia's done so much of the work behind the scenes, so thank you, Natalia.
Thank you, Caroline. Now we're doing a bit of seat swapping because, for one thing, this, of course, is being broadcast on the internet, and so it's important that Baroness Tong is heard clearly in the microphone despite her protestations, so that she can be broadcast on the internet. And there will, later on, I should say, when we get to questions, there'll be an opportunity for people who are watching this live through live streaming to ask their questions. They will be relayed to me on a piece of paper, reverting to older forms of technology. I will then read those questions, and so people who are not able to be with us today will also be able to participate in these proceedings. Over to Baroness Tong now.
Thank you very much indeed. Can you hear me if I stand up? Because I prefer to stand up. Have a power complex or something. Just a little bit of background, and I will be very brief. In early 1999, when the famine was just sort of coming to an end, there'd been a big famine, I went to Bahr el Ghazal with a friend of my son's who worked at Christian Aid. That was my first trip as an international development spokesman to anywhere. And I frankly could not believe what I experienced there. I have never seen anything like it. When I say the people in Bahr el Ghazal had nothing, I mean they had nothing. They were living on berries, they were living on a bit of food aid, they had nowhere to live, they had nothing. But the one thing they did have was cartridge cases from the Civil War, which of course was still raging. They melted them down and made them into bangles. And I was given this, some of you have probably heard me wave this around, seen me wave this around before. I was given this by a woman in Bahr el Ghazal who had nothing else but wanted me to have this to remember the people of southern Sudan, and she made me promise to wear it until there was peace. I'm still wearing it. I'm still wearing it. It's close by with another bracelet which was given to me to remember what's going on in the Middle East, but I won't go on to that. But it really illustrates the desperate poverty of the people in southern Sudan and the continuing desperation of those people. Nothing really has been solved yet, even since the signing of the CPA. And I just want to highlight one thing, and that is that the world is facing an absolute rush for the remaining resources of oil and probably water. But oil in the case of Sudan is the big issue. Until, as a world community, we can somehow get a fair agreement and a transparent agreement as how resources will be shared, and make sure that the people who extract the oil can declare how much money they are giving to the people on whose land, from whose land they extract it. And transparency is of the uttermost importance. It may seem good to grab as much as you can and pile it into your own particular little projects, but it will not cause lasting peace, and continuing war damages everybody. And it couldn't be more true than for the people of Sudan. You go to Khartoum, it's a wonderful place. I love Khartoum. I love the people in the north there and around Khartoum. I've always had the most amazing reception. Hospitality, cultural activities, all sorts of things going on. And then you think of what's going on in the rest of that vast country. It is quite disgraceful, actually. So all I say is, read this report, but concentrate very hard. And I say this to you, Minister, because you are a very powerful lady.
I'll stand up as well to prove it.
The international community really needs to get to grips with transparency when it comes to extracting resources. And I leave you with that thought: transparency, transparency, transparency. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Well, I think John and I are surrounded by very powerful ladies today, and another one who's going to speak to us just before we hear the Minister is Sara Pantuliano, who is going to address Chapter 3 of the report on elections, referendums and beyond. I must say that we were extraordinarily blessed in having expertise in the form, particularly of Sarah and Alex Duval, present at many of our hearings, and then being able to assist us in the compilation of the report and its recommendations. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you. It is a privilege to be here today and to welcome you to ODI as well, since that's where I work. It has been a privilege to be part of this exercise and to witness the passion that the UK Parliament has for Sudan, as well as the passion of so many people that have come to provide evidence. I'll say a few things about what we have been hearing about the elections and the referendum. The hearings were characterized by quite a lot of pessimism around the elections, a lot of concern that, the brief democratic history of Sudan would inevitably lead to a process around the elections that would be fraught with difficulties. And just reflecting on the history of past elections, sort of very little confidence that this exercise would be very different. Specific issues around the outstanding legislation, especially around the media law and the national security law, and the limited space for opposition, both in the north and in the south, although that seems to have improved lately. However, I've just come back from southern Sudan. I've spent 2.5 weeks in southern Sudan. I came back last week, and I must say that I've been tremendously energized by seeing how passionate people are discussing the elections in southern Sudan. I was in the south. I spent quite a bit of time in Lake State and in Juba. And in Lakes, you would see people, debating around the candidates at local level, at the village level, in Rumbek, in the state capital. And I was one of those, that actually did think that having been part of the negotiations in Navasha, the elections had been more of a concern for the international community than for the Sudanese, and a requirement that, the internationals had pushed for more than, something that the Sudanese very much wanted. Well, I was wrong, and it was great to be seen, to be proved wrong, seeing how much the Sudanese really want this election to work. But the concerns remain, and despite, some of the concerns about how elections could be, potentially gerrymandered. There are technical problems around the elections that leave very important concerns. Look at the vastity of Sudan. Look at how difficult it is technically to mount an election there. Look at the difficulty of the ballot papers. In Sudan, people are in the north voting on 8 different ballot papers. I have to write them down because even for me it's difficult to get my head around it. So people are voting. They have 3 ballots each for the National Assembly and the State Assembly, and 1 for the national president and 1 for the state governor. That's 8 ballot papers. In the south, they have 12. So it's 3 for the National Assembly, 3 for the State Assembly, 3 for the Southern Sudan Assembly, 1 for the National President, and 1 for the President of Southern Sudan. Now, Baroness Cox was reminding us of the level of illiteracy in Sudan. Couple that with the complexity of this election, and inevitably we will see confusion and malcontent when the election results arrive. And that's what we need to focus our attention on. Despite the process, the sheer difficulty of delivering the results of this election will create tensions when the results are announced. And it's important that we urgently focus on how we're going to manage these hotspots, how the parties intend to address issues that will inevitably arise when the election results are announced and not the international community will support. And that leads me to the referendum. I'll say something very briefly, because the confusion that may arise after the election will inevitably impact on the preparations of the referendum. And this is together with a lot of outstanding issues that need to be sorted out more urgently from now. These include, wealth sharing agreements post-2011, security arrangements post-2011, the border demarcation, bearing in mind that communities on the border have a very different perception of where the border is compared to the 1956 border. And very importantly, the status of Southerners in the north, which lately has come under some questioning. Now, this is of crucial importance to address whether Sudan remains united, because there is only 90 days that the CPA allows for integration, for instance, of the security forces, or whether it divides. We know that the parties have started to talk about these issues and that the international community is providing support, but we also know that the parties in Sudan have a tendency to agree last-minute deals, and that may leave out some of the deeper causes of concern for the communities, which is very urgent to address.
Thank you very much, Sara.